Singapore has no oil, no gold, no farmland, not even enough fresh water to survive on its own. In 1965, this island nation had a GDP per capita of roughly $516. Guess what the number today? That number is around $100,000. That's richer than the US, Germany, or even Japan. So how did this tiny island end up being richer than most countries that have everything? To understand how Singapore became rich without natural resources, we need to go back to the moment it almost didn't survive at all. On August 9, 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia. This wasn't a heroic independence moment. It was a political divorce, forced, sudden, and humiliating. Overnight, Singapore lost access to Malaysia's food supply, its fresh water agreements, its domestic market, and its strategic depth. What remained was a densely packed island with no buffer and no backup plan. Half of the population lived in overcrowded slums. Unemployment hovered between 13 to 14%. Communal violence between ethnic groups was still very fresh. Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore, standing before cameras, broke down in tears. Not because he was proud, but he understood something brutal, that Singapore was now alone. At that moment, GDP per capita was $516, life expectancy was 65 years, port facilities was outdated, and foreign reserves almost non-existent. Singapore wasn't poor by choice. It was poor by circumstance. Instead of asking, how do we protect ourselves, they asked, how do we make ourselves so useful that the world cannot ignore us? That single question forced Singapore into a gamble so risky that if it failed, there would be no second attempt. In the 1960s, post-colonial nations followed a familiar script: protect local industries, restrict foreign ownership, and build self-resilience first. Singapore tore that script up and went completely the opposite way. Instead of shielding itself from global capitalism, it ran directly into it. Foreign companies were allowed to own 100% of operations, repatriate profits freely, and operate under clear and predictable laws. This wasn't caution, this was exposure. So why take the risk? Because they understood something that you can't protect what you don't have.
I did not believe that there was no other way.
If foreign capital didn't come, Singapore would be left with no domestic industry, no fallback economy, and no safety net. Singapore realized that you cannot industrialize without capital, and capital won't come unless it is trusted. By the early 1970s, manufacturing exports surged. Foreign direct investment poured in, and port throughput exploded. By 1980, Singapore's GDP per capita reached $4,900, nearly 10x growth in just 15 years. But openness alone isn't enough, because when money moves fast, weak systems break even faster. Singapore made an observation that many countries learn too late. Capital is cowardly. It avoids uncertainty, it hates inconsistency, and it flees corruption instantly. So Singapore attacked corruption not as a moral issue but an existential threat. The institutional hardline was civil servants paid at market rates, judges compensated to resist bribery, and anti-corruption agencies given real teeth. Cases were public, punishments were real, and no one was untouchable. But that system demanded control, media restrictions, protest limitations, and political opposition tightly managed. By the 1990s, Singapore ranked among the top 5 least corrupt countries globally. This reputation became an economic asset. When money flowing in and corruption under control, Singapore ran into its next bottleneck. Singapore had no oil fields, no mines, no farmland, so it treated humans as its only natural resource. Education wasn't about philosophy like most other countries, it was about productivity. The system worked like this: English as the working language, math, science, engineering prioritized, and universities synced with industry needs. That third option is pretty rare in many countries. Degrees weren't abstract. They were functional. Singapore didn't wait for labor markets to evolve, it engineered them. By 1995, GDP per capita crossed $24,000. Singapore was no longer cheap labor, it was precision labor. But rapid growth creates a different kind of danger, and economic growth without social stability is fragile, and Singapore knew that. Most countries let housing markets evolve organically. Singapore didn't. It engineered ownership at scale. Over 80% of citizens live in government-built housing, and the vast majority own their homes. So why this was strategic? Because home ownership anchors citizens, reduces unrest, and aligns personal wealth into national growth. The Central Provident Fund forced savings, channeling capital into housing and infrastructure. Citizens weren't just workers, they were stakeholders of the nation. With stability at home secured, Singapore shifted outward to become Asia's central node. Singapore stopped asking, what should we produce? Instead, it asked, where can we sit in the global system so that everyone needs to pass through us? And the answer was everything in between: shipping, finance, arbitration, aviation, and trade coordination. Singapore didn't try to dominate the region, it just tried to connect it. By 2023, trade volume exceeded 300% of GDP. Foreign reserves surpassed $300 billion, and Singapore became indispensable without being threatening. Wealth didn't stay in Singapore by accident. It stayed because living made no sense. So if this model worked so well, why hasn't the world copied it? Because Singapore's success isn't a formula, it's a sequence. Break the order and the system collapses. It requires discipline before democracy, public trust in institutions, willingness to delay gratification, and acceptance of uncomfortable trade-offs. Most nations abandon the plan halfway through, but Singapore didn't. Singapore proves a dangerous idea that wealth isn't extracted, it's engineered. Natural resources run out, but systems compound. And Singapore built one of the most disciplined systems the modern world has ever seen. But here's one more question. If Singapore's power totally depends on global systems, what happens when those systems break?